Welcome to the January forum of the Forum on World Education. We are delighted this morning to offer an opportunity to hear from researchers about a very important new report that the National Academy of Sciences has produced, How People Learn Too. And we are doing this in collaboration with the Global Science of Learning Education Network. I'm going to turn it over to Bob Wise, who will talk about the programming, but I just wanted to let everybody know that the purpose of the forum is to transform education in response to the skills and knowledge we know will be required for the future of our young people and a very global future at that. If we want to sustain our economic growth, have societal progress and sustainability, we need to be focusing on issues that bring together the education community with the business community and the philanthropic community so that we can be sure that our young people are getting the preparation that they need in order to be successful. So I'm delighted to turn it over to Bob Wise, who is our moderator this morning and who is working with the Global Science of Learning Education Network, one that is obviously very concerned about these issues of how people learn. And Bob, here's to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. I greatly appreciate the opportunity, and on behalf of the Global Science of Learning Education Network, the opportunity to partner with FWE, Forum for World Education, in this important video conference, Lessons from How People Learn to the Opportunities, the Imperatives for Education, the opportunities for education in a post-COVID world. I want to talk a little bit, just a moment, about what the Global Science of Learning Education Network is. It focuses on engaging all sectors, the research community, the policy community, the education community, the philanthropic community, all sectors key to wide-scale social science of learning implementation to develop and share strategies across nations and cultures. And particularly given this time of the COVID pandemic and how it has accelerated certain it's accelerated all aspects of our life and certainly confronts us with a lot of decisions in education. The over 400 members of the Global Science of Learning Education Network work in working groups, and I'm happy, and I'll talk a little bit later, perhaps in Q&A. This gives us this webinar, this video conference gives us a chance to announce the formation of the digital learning working group that will identify certain areas that we want to use the best international research to develop solutions that apply across cultures and nations. So the real issue here, and why I'm so excited about this video conference, is how does a major report, and I was interested in a little pre-video webinar discussion, somebody said How People Learn Too is a classic. It just leaps off the shelf. You want to grab it right away. How does a major report, such as How People Learn Too, on science of learning affect the response to COVID-19? And how does COVID-19 in turn affect, alter, or accelerate the implementation of how people learn? Heidi and Heidi Schweingruber, Dr. Schweingruber, in just a moment will give some of the background of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine that produced the report. Barbara Means, Dr. Means will talk about some aspects of the report itself, but I think it's important to also look at, since the report was published, I believe in 2018, what is it that we are learning? How does the report affect how we respond to COVID-19, and in turn how is COVID-19 affecting what was in the report. A little bit of an update. UNESCO yesterday, I believe, released some statistics. Over 800 million students are still in some form of altered education, where their countries have not completely returned to in-person school. So digital learning is still and will be in a very, very important part of the education process, both now and going forward. OECD reported in May that one fifth of all the nations had only 1/5 said that they wanted to go back to the way it was. And so, Susan, as you just said, this is about how do we move from where education triage that we've all been doing across all of our nations in varying degrees, how do we move from education triage and then do a transition to a transformed education system, not just going back to what we had before, which many of us weren't satisfied with. Mm-hmm. I believe that we are in a very critical moment now, because on one hand, it's what I call the 3 V's. On one hand, we see vaccines and the hope that this actually begins to show a way that we can provide the kind of education that we want. On the other hand, we have still have volatility, not only triage that was being undertaken before, but now with mutant strains, some countries locking down again. We understand that we're not clear of this by any means. And at the same time, people have a vision for what they want. So we have vaccines, we have volatility, we have vision, all coming together. And how people learn to make a difference with that. So that's the basis for this. This is an hour and a half, 90 minutes. We will be hearing from 2 presenters on the publication itself, and then we will move to 2 discussants. Dr. Schweingruber, Heidi Schweingruber, Dr. Barbara Means there'll be a video from Dr. Means, and then we will move to the discussants, Professor Nancy Law of the University of Hong Kong, Professor Ken Koedinger of Carnegie Mellon, and then open it up for Q&A. So at this point, let me introduce Dr. Heidi Schweingruber. The bios, incidentally, are on the program, but I want to emphasize that Heidi is the director of the Board on Science Education at the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, the organization that is responsible for how people learn too. And she's where she oversees the education portfolio, K-12, informal education, and higher education. She's also recognized for leveraging research findings to catalyze improvements in STEM education and practice. Dr. Schweingruber, thank you very much, and look forward to getting a background and then how we apply this to today's situation.
Terrific, thanks. And I'm going to share my screen, hopefully navigate the technology appropriately. So thank you for including me in this conversation. I think it's so important. We're going to be talking about how people learn to in kind of 2 parts. I'm going to give some background on how the report came to be and the way the Academies does its work, and highlight some of the major findings of the report, particularly those that have links to socio-emotional learning. Susan asked me to highlight those given their particular importance for the future workforce, and also for looking to recovering from the trauma that so many communities and families have experienced. So I wanted to start by giving you a little background on the organization. Not everyone knows who we are and what we do. The full name is the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. We're a non-governmental organization, even though it says national. We are not a federal agency. We were founded by Abraham Lincoln to address issues in science and technology for the nation. So it was designed to tap the expertise of a range of experts in the United States to guide decisions that the government would make. One of the first questions that was given to the academies was how to use a compass on an ironclad ship during the Civil War. A very important question at that time. And that approach to work, identifying a problem or set of questions, and then convening the appropriate set of experts to respond to them, tapping their knowledge and the lines of evidence available, is sort of the hallmark of our work. So we take that into our tagline as advising the nation, meaning the United States. But we also, as the institution has grown, we have developed a broad set of work that covers many different areas. We no longer only inform the federal government, but also take on issues that really have implications across the country and the world, really. So we also connect with other scientific societies all over the world. So the way that we do our work, as I mentioned, is to convene these committees. And for How People Learn Too, this was a follow-on to one of our premier reports, How People Learn, which Bob mentioned, which really brought together, was released in 2000 and brought together several decades of work in the learning sciences and cognitive science and educational psychology on what do we know about how learning happens and what are the implications, particularly for schools in the first book. So it really looked more at school-aged children and youth, and what does that mean about how we should re-examine education. How People Learn Too then built on that foundation. Much of the foundational work around cognitive science and learning sciences hadn't completely overturned the things that we knew in that first book, but it was more narrow. And so How People Learn Too, the committee was asked to take a more expansive view across the lifespan and consider other contexts, not just school. The committee was then asked to identify those issues and topics with the greatest potential to influence practice and policy. So where do we have lines of evidence that can be turnkeyed into thinking carefully about education writ large? There is also laid out in the book some work on what are new directions for research and development. We will not be covering those given the focus today, but they are in the report, which is available free PDF download and to read online. And I can give you a link at the end. So putting together the committee to address this very broad charge, as you might imagine, was challenging. We can't have a room full of 50 people. The process is to examine multiple lines of research and work with the committee to come to consensus on the key takeaways that they all believe are reflected in the evidence, where the evidence is pointing for some definitive things we can say about learning and about implications for education. So the committee draws on a number of different areas of expertise, some of them represented here. These are the actual folks that we pulled together, really a dream team of people with a variety of backgrounds. And Barbara Means, who will be giving the take two of the overview of the report with a focus on technology, was on this committee. And incidentally, she was also on the original How People Learn committee. So she brought an incredible history to the work, but really an all-star cast of folks contributed to this from some really different perspectives. And that's one of the real value that National Academies work brings, is truly looking across different lines of work, often that develop in isolation and research traditions that may not talk to each other, and provide a context for looking across them and really synthesizing findings that sometimes look disparate, but when brought together can be very powerful. So the report's conclusions address a number of big topics. As you might imagine, this was a very broad scope. I encourage you, of course, to look at the whole report. The major conclusions map somewhat to the chapters. What you see in red here are some things that I'm going to highlight in trying to show where there are some closer connections to socio-emotional learning, but also implications for schooling that seem particularly important to think about in the context of COVID-19, and what can education look like transformed by what we've learned from COVID-19. So I'm going to do a quick overview of some of these major findings, and then we'll have time to discuss them. And some of these will also come back in Barbara's more deep discussion about learning technology. So one of the major discussions in the book is about how complex learning is and how much it's shaped by culture and context and social interaction. And that if we bring a vision of learning that's only something that happens in an individual person's head, we're really misunderstanding the incredibly complex dynamics and how much each learner develops a unique set of knowledge and cognitive resources and competencies through those complex interactions. And really understanding that whole sweep and the complexities of the interaction of culture and context and history is very important for understanding learning. So some of the key insights based on that finding are that we have to understand that cultural influences shape learners from the start of life. And when we're talking about cultural influences, sometimes we think of culture and think of the really obvious things, language or religion or particular beliefs. But actually it also is translated into much more fine-grained things like artifacts and tools or norms of interaction. And we have to understand that from the earliest start of life, those are influencing how people are engaging in learning contexts, the tools they're using to learn, and the dynamics with other people. So learning really is inherently social. Even when we have an isolated individual, they're using tools developed by other people. Their learning is facilitated when they have an opportunity to interact with others. Also, different cultures may place different value on different kinds of learning. So for example, Barbara Rogoff did some fascinating studies looking at interactions between parents and children in Mayan communities and your typical sort of middle-class American communities. And there was a difference in the kind of mode of learning that parents emphasized, whereas the American families, parents did a lot of talking. So almost a constant stream of dialogue and a lot of verbal instruction when they were trying to encourage a child to learn a new task. In the Mayan communities, there was much more predominance of observational learning. So not as much talking and more this child really intently observing and the parent assuming that through that observation, the children would be able to pick up new tasks. If you think about how different that mode is and the implications when children move into a classroom and whether that classroom is designed around a Mayan model or the American model, you can see where we really have to be thinking about those matches of context and modes of learning. And that leads to the other point, which is that the context that people learn in are not culture free, right? So even routines like raising hands or turn taking have a cultural component and may be different from what kids bring. A really simple example is in some cultures and some indigenous communities in the Americas, adults never ask children questions that the adults themselves already know the answers to, which means that the script in school where adults are often asking questions that they already know the answers to can be confusing for a child unless they understand there's different norms here. So we really have to attend to that, moving in and out of different learning settings. So one of the implications for schooling of this is embracing cultural differences. So often when we see these differences in a classroom, kids bringing different experiences from their communities and their homes, and not necessarily participating in learning through the cultural practices of the dominant culture, we might see that as a deficit, as a problem that these kids are bringing. Instead, we want to embrace cultural differences and really look for the assets that kids bring from the experiences in their communities and homes, and that we can leverage to move them toward our more sort of formal learning in the academic content areas. So we need to look for curricular and instructional approaches that help make those connections, really acknowledging that things are happening for kids outside of school. They have experiences that can be leveraged for in-school learning. And this is a place where it's probably going to be particularly important to be thinking about this, where kids have been having potentially more time at home doing learning in these hybrid and virtual situations, or they may have been experiencing things outside of school that are traumatic and have dramatically changed their lives. So we really need to think about that in-school, out-of-school connection and find the on-ramps for school learning. So the book also really digs deeply into what do we know about brain development, cognitive processes, how do they develop over time? There's a number of conclusions related to those. I wanted to pop out this one about how complicated successful learning is, requiring coordination of sort of multiple cognitive processes that work together, different networks in the brain. And to coordinate it, the individual needs to be able to monitor and regulate their own learning. And we've heard the research in these areas have really grown. These sort of mechanisms or abilities to coordinate learning include metacognition, that is sort of the ability to monitor and regulate your own cognitive processes. So being aware of your own thinking, being aware of your own learning, and being able to direct it. So a very simple example, understanding the limits of your own memory, knowing when you need to write something down, or that rehearsing something can help you remember it more. Those involve metacognition, sort of understanding your own thinking. And that's important for successful learning. Another piece is executive function, which is the cognitive and neural processing that allows you to regulate thinking and behavior. So you're linking the things like planning and sequencing, initiating and sustaining behavior toward a goal or toward a learning goal. It includes holding your information in mind, inhibiting an incorrect response, attention, sustaining attention or switching attention as needed for a particular goal. All learners need to juggle this sort of competition for attention and competition for focus. And executive function comes into play, sort of controlling your own thinking and attention and the behavior involved. And finally, self-regulation, which is learning that's focused using metacognition, strategic action, and it connects to motivation. All of these are also really important in socio-emotional processes and socio-emotional development. And the good news is that many of these abilities can be supported and improved through interventions. And so in education, we can design things to be supporting and enhancing these abilities to monitor and regulate your own learning. So implications for schooling is educators can engage learners in directing their own learning with targeted feedback. So this kind of targeted feedback can be very informal, kind of on the fly feedback, or it can be more formal in written ways, helping students kind of see and reflect on their own learning, providing challenges that are well matched to current capacity, but maybe also a little pushy. So really understanding where kids are and helping them to develop these strategies for monitoring their own learning and understanding sort of where they need to go next. One of the challenges, how do we build this into virtual learning environments? How do we do this in hybrid environments? How are we going to do this when we're getting back and kids have been sort of experienced all different kinds of learning contexts and maybe in very different places in terms of where we expect them to be in academic learning? How do we keep this piece in? It's really important to be thinking about this kind of metacognition and executive function, because when we aren't thinking about it, we can underestimate or inaccurately assess what kids are able to do cognitively. So a simple example, compelling from the work that I do in science education, was a study. Many people had assumed that children didn't understand control of variables in scientific investigations. So some experimenters pulled together teams of adults and teams of elementary age kids to engage in doing some experiments where they would have to systematically change one variable after another to find out which one actually was affecting the ultimate phenomena. Not surprisingly, in a first cut, the adults did much better and the kids appeared to not be able to sort of do the analysis for thinking about which variable was the cause at all. But then the experimenters intervened and realized the adults were spontaneously taking notes systematically on each of the experiments that they ran, knowing they couldn't remember from trial to trial, knowing they wouldn't be able to sort of do the analysis and keep track, whereas the kids were just kind of doing it willy-nilly. There was nothing systematic. They weren't taking notes. When the experimenters intervened and helped the kids understand how to support their own cognition through a way to track systematically what was happening in each trial and order their own memories, the kids then were able to demonstrate a better understanding of control of variables and sort of the sophisticated abstract thinking. So we really need to think about this part of learning in supporting kids. So another piece that the committee really touched on was the importance of motivation, and I would say also emotion. So we've really come to understand that sometimes people have had a take on learning that it's sort of like the cold cognition, not understanding how much learning, even dry academic subjects, is really bound up with motivation and emotion and identity. And you really have to think of them as together. And motivation to learn is influenced by the multiple goals of the individuals. Like, what do I bring to a learning setting from my own experiences outside of school, as well as the nature of the context in school? And motivation to learn is fostered when an individual perceives the school or learning environment as a place where they belong and where it promotes a sense of agency and purpose. And again, I think this raises questions for, in a virtual or hybrid world, how are we developing and thinking about these motivational components of learning? And how will we address them as we're re-envisioning this education post-COVID? So some of the implications for schooling: educators can support motivation by creating learning experiences that learners value. So here's a place where understanding and connecting with students' experiences outside of school, the problems that may be, or the ideas that may be compelling to them because of experiences in the community or family, can be really valuable for educators to be thinking about and leveraging. Allowing some room for control and autonomy, for choice, developing competencies, and also this emotionally supportive and non-threatening environment. And this is something that, in my opinion, will be particularly important as we're moving post-COVID. And all of us in communities and families across the globe have had a tremendously difficult year or more. And we're going to be needing to think about the emotional and social needs of kids as we move them back into schools, because we know how intimately connected academic and cognitive outcomes are to these emotional and social issues. So you really need to be thinking about that. So this is the end of my half, and I'm going to hand it off to Barbara. But before I finish this piece, I'd be remiss without thanking these sponsors. We could not have, all of the work of the National Academies is done with money from outside of the academies. All of our projects are funded with outside funding. These foundations really recognize the need to update the original How People Learn and expand the scope and bring in some of the issues that I just talked about and that Barbara will talk about. And then I also wanted to let you know, this is the website for the National Academies Press where all of our reports are, and you might even explore some other titles that we have. There's a whole body of work related to education and learning. But if you go here and then in the search engine type in How People Learn, you'll arrive at a page for the report. And that ends my portion, and I'm going to hand it off to Barbara. Thank you so much.
So thank you very much, Heidi. And one thing I would like to ask, you've generated a lot of questions, which is positive, but I would ask people if you would mind putting them in the Q&A section, because the chat section is rapidly building up and it's hard to sort through there. So I noticed that Sebastian and Paul and others have asked some excellent questions, and we want to get to those when the Q&A period comes. So at this point, we're going to show a video, and Barbara may also be joining us. Let me talk for just a moment about Dr. Barbara Means, who is the executive director of the Learning Sciences Research at Digital Promise. She studies and currently studying equity impacts of that caused by the remote instruction caused by COVID. Obviously incredibly timely, and she served on the panels that produced both How People Learn 1, the first edition, and then now the second one, How People Learn 2. So we're very fortunate to have her explain particularly the aspects dealing with technology. Let's show the video.
that in how people learn too, the coverage was for many kinds of learning, not simply learning in school or model-based learning, which was really the focus of how people learn one. Rather, how people learn two covers things from birth throughout the lifetime and different kinds of learning, such as forming habits or observational learning, perceptual motor learning, model-based learning, fact learning, and pattern recognition or statistical learning. And the point that is important to remember about this before we turn to technology is that different situations will call on different ones of these learning mechanisms in different combinations. And the best support for learning is going to vary depending on the kind of learning involved. So for example, promoting memory for specific facts can be helped if one has many practice trials and spaces them over time. And also practicing the retrieval part rather than just rereading helps memory for facts. On the other hand, if what you're trying to do is transfer learning from one particular situation to applying it with somewhat different situation in a different setting, then comparing and contrasting multiple instances is important. And reflecting on the phenomenon and whether it is or is not present is more important than simply repeating back or practicing retrieving what you've been told. So with this in mind, I'll turn now to talking about the different technologies for learning that are covered in the volume. The approach that the coverage takes is to think about what is it that digital learning does particularly well, or the affordances of technology. And a number of those are listed here. You can see in the slide, things like interactivity or being able to provide ready feedback automatically and patiently, providing nonlinear access to material, and communicating with others, of course. The right-hand column has some of the particular kinds of technology applications that are illustrated in the course. But before we go on to talk about those, I think it's important to recognize, if you will, the moment that we happen to be in. HPL2 came out before COVID-19. So what we see now in COVID-19 has given many of us a familiarity with learning and interacting online at much greater length of time than we had before. Certainly our children are experiencing that. But it's important to distinguish between the kind of carefully designed learning supported by digital technology that's described in How People Learn Too, and what happened during the pandemic, which in most cases is better labeled as remote learning. It's what we could do under the circumstances. It was very important, but far from the kind of learning described in HPL2. So back to HPL2. One of the other distinguishing features of this volume is the fact that it places so much emphasis on the socio-emotional aspects of learning and the cultural aspects of learning. It talks about engagement and intrinsic motivation developing over time and being strongly influenced by the particular culture and cultural values of an individual. So this kind of motivation is fostered when students feel a sense of belonging or rightful belonging in the place of learning, and they feel a purpose that connects with something that they value and think is important. This is something that either carefully designed digital materials or instructors themselves can do. And so we have some examples from the volume. COVID certainly highlighted the issue of digital divides, and we could see the importance of that. It's not just a matter of having an internet connection and some kind of a computing device, but when your learning depends entirely on being able to learn at a distance, the nature of that computing device and the quality of the internet connection can really be important. If you have to share it with other members in your household, if the internet connection isn't stable, if you're trying to learn on a smartphone and something requires a large screen in order to for you to interact with learning materials, you're going to be at a serious disadvantage. And beyond just having that infrastructure for learning through technology. There's also the issue of the cultural support you have in the home and the family. Do you have somebody who can help you troubleshoot if your internet goes down? Is there someone who can show you how to use a learning management system? We're not equal in terms of what we have in all our households for doing that, and COVID really brought that home. So we see that as very important, but we also see opportunities here. One of the things we talk about and how people learn too is, for example, how a blend of screen-based activities and other activities not involving digital materials can be facilitated by a parent or caregiver for young children and help them acquire the fundamentals of reading and mathematics and science principles. We also talk about technology-supported learning outside the classroom, the many hours learning that many students enjoy or choose to engage in with games and online. They learn by being participants and gradually assuming more control and gaining more competence in the activities they engage in. How people learn too also reflects the fact that learners differ in their biological makeup, their prior learning, their goals, and the cultural practices and funds of knowledge they bring to the learning activity. An interesting part of how people learn too is, I think, the discussion of older learners and work that's being done on trying to adapt practices in the workplace to make it easier for them to learn with technology. How people learn too as a whole provides a window into the complexities of human learning. And it's not surprising that as we start thinking about all of these different complexities coming to play, we wonder how a single person, any teacher, can possibly consider all of that in trying to plan classroom activities. But we do see that there are technology tools that are starting to help do that and supporting individual learners. The little girl in the lower right corner, for example, is still learning English, but she's able to participate in classroom language art activities with her peers because she has headphones on and can hear the words spoken as she is reading them and following the activities. We have some examples here of some of the kinds of technologies described in how people learn too. I skipped over the games. This is Mystery of Taiga River, where youth take on the role of a scientist to save a park through inquiry by Sasha Barab. This kind of game-based learning can provide a context for practice, or it can provide a context for inquiry learning and exploring a complex system. They can be designed to leverage the motivational benefits of mystery and exploration, or they can be designed in a more competitive way with mechanisms such as leveling, point systems, and rewards. And of course, there's every possible combination of those two approaches. Intelligent tutoring systems are also described in the volume. This is one of the kinds of applications of technology with the longest research history. And these systems generate content and feedback based on a continuously improving model of the learner. And many of the techniques explored with them are now in common commercial systems, which may or may not have the AI backing of the research-based ITS. Conversational agents are something that is being combined with a number of intelligent tutoring systems and games. These are ways that we can investigate that we can capture the benefits of peer learning, even when students are learning by themselves. We know that that social part of learning is very important to promoting engagement. We also know that students sometimes learn best when they're trying to explain something to a peer, or they can learn with the confidence of the peer support as they're exploring new ideas. And we in fact have systems that are providing computer-based agents that through AI are able to provide that same kind of dialogue and that same kind of support for learning. Collaborative learning is another very important area. We see that mobile and spatially aware technology applications can support joint problem solving by teams of people who are located in different places. Researchers are designing these kinds of applications in ways that are applied to issues that young people care about. In the Mobile City Science Project, for example, from which this photo comes, sponsored by the National Science Foundation, urban youth collect data about community resources in their neighborhoods, things like libraries and community centers. And then they look at the relationship of those places to barriers for accessing the resources, such as a lack of safe routes between where people live and where the resources are located. The young people engaged in this project use the software to pool their data and make maps of their communities as they are today, and also maps of how their communities might be changed to provide more access to those community resources. Other learning activities then encourage the young people engaging in this project to become leaders in making data-based arguments for changes within their communities. Now, these kinds of applications are evolving very quickly. Don't look to how people learn too for the latest in technology applications. But the principles of teaching and learning do not evolve so quickly. And so that's really what you can find in how people learn too. And I want to close with some of the conclusions from the volume and some of the main messages it strives to give those who are interested in technology-supported learning. First, the decision to use a technology for learning should be based on evidence indicating that the technology has a positive impact in learning situations that are similar to the one that the designer or the teacher is about to embark on. And it talks about the different forms of similarity that are important to remember. There is empirical support for the effectiveness of learning technologies under certain conditions, but there's no one universally ideal learning technology. The effectiveness of learning technology depends on the characteristics of the learner, the types of learning being targeted, sociocultural context, and support from instructors for use of the technologies. The implementation is critically important. And so you can't just pick the best product and expect to have the results you're looking for. It's a process, not just a matter of finding the right technology product. They don't build effectiveness inside technology products. So instead you think about identifying the kinds of learning outcomes you're looking for and matching those to technologies with affordances for those outcomes. Once you've chosen a technology, in most cases, at least post-COVID and for younger learners, there will be both technology-based aspects of the learning and then other aspects of learning in the classroom, face-to-face. Making sure that those two aspects of instruction are integrated and fit together rather than creating noise because they use different terminology or different approaches is very important. We see that over and over. And then you need to try it out. This is a complex design problem. And the first attempt, even if you are very adept with using the technology, is not likely to be perfect. So rather thinking in terms of trying things out, seeing how they go, and then coming back and improving. So that leads me to the final conclusion about learning with technology. Effective use of technologies in formal education and training settings requires this kind of careful planning for implementation, addressing the factors we've talked about and that issue of alignment. It also means that if you're doing this on a large scale, there needs to be professional learning opportunities and supports for those who are going to be doing the instruction, as well as for the learners if they're not familiar with the technology per se. And then finally, we come full circle back to that issue of equitable access to the technology. So it's not just that everyone has a computer, but everyone has equivalent and effective access to what they need to learn with the particular technology applications that are at issue here. And finally, ongoing assessment of student learning in order to see how this went and improve it for the next time. So with that, I thank you and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. The video, in between the video and Heidi's presentation, it sets up well the discussion that we're about to have. And particularly as I listened and as I prepared for this, I was thinking in some ways how much, how people learn too was foretelling in some ways what was to come. But now the question is, how do we adapt and use it? And at the same time, how do we shape our response to COVID of using how people learn? So at this point, let's turn to our discussants. And happy to introduce first Dr. Ken Koedinger, with the professor at the Professor Carnegie Mellon University in the Human-Computer Interaction of Psychology. Ken's well known for research and understanding human learning and creating educational technologies that increase student achievement. I appreciate, I've always watched Ken from a distance, and I appreciate that you're about application. You head Learnt Lab, which builds upon a foundation of online tutoring in reaching hundreds of thousands, if not millions of students. So love to have your response to the presentations.
Oh, it's great to be here. I have prepared some slides and will share my screen here. I hope you can now see my slides. I want to build on what Heidi and Barbara said, and particularly about the complexity of this space, and also the process notion that Barbara just emphasized. I also want to elaborate on a part of the learning science that I think is so important, but sometimes under-recognized, and that's better learning of fundamental skills. And these are often skills you don't know you know. They're implicit, hidden under the surface, as it were, especially in the way the brain acquires them. And these are the kinds of things that online support for learning, like the intelligent tutors Barbara mentioned, can be so powerful in helping students acquire. So I want to take a kind of yes and approach here in building on what Heidi and Barbara said. So indeed, learning and education, they're complex, as both Heidi and Barbara said, and they're complex on many dimensions, and we heard about a lot of those dimensions. I want to focus on the instructional dimension and posed to myself a question a number of years ago about how many different ways there are to teach, and especially looking into the literature on recommendations for how to teach, and starting to explore that, particularly in applying these techniques in our educational technologies. I did this analysis of the space of instructional design that led to the conclusion that there's about 200 trillion different ways to teach. It's incredibly complex just in that single dimension. And if it were the case that you could work through that space using the science and come up with a combination on each of these dimensions that always worked great, it wouldn't be so bad. But it turns out there's lots of evidence that there is no one size fits all choice, that I think, as Barbara also mentioned, you need to pick the right solution for the right problem. And it's very critical. And we had the opportunity to have a Science of Learning Center for about 10 years, and we were investigating these principles in the context of many different courses, particularly in math and science and language learning. I mean, we developed this knowledge, learning, and instruction framework to try to help provide some guidance relative to this huge complexity. And basically, the pluses here indicate studies we did applying principles in contexts that worked, and the zeros were no difference, and the negatives indicate times where the principle actually made things worse. And what the CLE framework suggests is that ideal instruction depends on the knowledge goals that you're after. And that's because they rely on different learning processes. And Barbara mentioned that there are multiple different learning processes we want to help, right? And so in particular, we make this three-way distinction between memory of facts, induction and refinement of skills, and also underlying representations, how you see the world, and finally, understanding and sense-making. So in essence, this three-way distinction reduces us from 200 trillion to maybe 3 options. And in particular, they're in these 3 categories: memory of facts, induction of skills and representation, and understanding of principles. I want to particularly highlight that middle one because I think we tend to focus on facts and principles because they're both verbalizable and the skills are more tacit and implicit. I think, in fact, in practice, and even maybe in the scientific field, we have a kind of bias towards explicit forms of learning. They're kind of like the flat part of the earth. It's what we see. We see verbal, we hear it, right? But the round part, what's there but hard to see, is that implicit nonverbal learning. It's this induction of representation and skills. And in the How People Learn second volume, I do think that there's a lot of discussion in these 2 areas, but not so much in this third area. So I think it's worth highlighting. Now, a focus on fundamental skills, in essence, I'm going to suggest reduces us to, I would say, not really the only option, and I want to get to the process point Barbara made, but in some sense, a way to simplify our thinking about what we can do to help students best learn when we're focused on those fundamental skills. And there are lots of kinds of skills. I think this is super important. There are core academic skills, reading and writing and math. There are STEM skills, science, technology, engineering, and math skills, computational thinking, argumentation, scientific thinking. There are collaboration and social soft skills, civil dialogue skills. There are self-regulatory skills and emotional skills. Much of this is learned implicitly or tacitly through doing. A little challenge here: show me something that's not a skill and I'll show you something you can't do. So here's my nutshell recommendation. And this is building off a notion called deliberate practice with a few added ideas. Learn by doing is critical. Good learn by doing instruction requires repeated practice on well-tailored tasks, and that's a part where the process is so important, in varied context, with explanatory feedback, and as needed instruction. You might note this doesn't say anything about lecturing and reading. The instruction comes in the context of the doing. And the instruction, in some sense, is in the structuring of the tasks and the design of the explanatory feedback, maybe even the design of the variation and the repetition. To learn X, you must do it. The brain needs convincing. And it's whether you do it in conversation, on paper, or online. All these forms of doing work, you can do it alone, with a tutor, with friends. Doing it with a tutor and friends helps you get feedback. You can do it alone with the world, and the world can help you get feedback. Feedback's certainly very critical. There's lots of research evidence, like evidence that even renowned experts require years of practice to reach their level of expertise. They're not born geniuses that already know how to play great music or discover great things. Another compelling version of this is how much reduction we see in academic achievement between different groups over the summer because of different academic experiences. I think the kind of learn by doing that often happens in many higher socioeconomic homes versus less so in others is a form of learning by doing, I think. Another one is we've amassed lots of data in many different domains where we can map out error rate learning curves. And we see that learning happens. Good news is we see every student essentially learning. They start at very different places often, but they all make progress with high quality learning opportunities. But it's not fast. It's about 2.5% increase in their accuracy for each opportunity. The brain really takes convincing. One piece of this from our technologies is a relationship between the hours spent in one of these online intelligent tutoring systems and the number of topics a student masters. More opportunities, more learning. It's a very strong relationship and a very important one. we've built these cognitive tutors, and they've been widely used, but they've also been widely evaluated. This was an independent evaluation, one of many, but quite a large one, involving random assignment within 140 schools, 70 using the cognitive tutor algebra course that we developed, and the other 70 teaching algebra in the traditional way. And the in brief result is an essential doubling of the learning gain over the year. There's a lot of important features of cognitive tutors, but many of them overlap, as Barbara mentioned, with similar products that are out there that offer forms of deliberate practice or formative assessment. What's really key is that there are quality learning by doing experiences with some adaptive instructional assistance, that feedback, and also that selection of well-tailored tasks. Just to give you a quick concrete, in cognitive tutors, we often, the well-tailored tasks include authentic problems to help students map the mathematics to real-world concerns. They're using multiple representations, and importantly, the instruction is in the context. But as Barbara essentially said, she said it's a process, and I like to call it iterative engineering as a key. And I hope we don't come up to take our theories of learning and apply them to practice. That's just the starting point. What we need is an iterative process that is based on a model of not just of expertise, but of our understandings of learning. These could be a model of motivation in some contexts, and then a design built off that model. But importantly here, some test of whether that model is working in practice that contributes to and helps explain whether those models work. And hopefully, perhaps insights that are gained in practice get brought back and contribute to our theory, which does evolve slowly, but indeed is continually evolving and getting more specific. So in summary, yes, learning and education are complex. The knowledge, learning, and instruction, or CLE framework, can help simplify that. And I want to emphasize that we should not forget that what is sometimes forgotten middle part, those nonverbal skill learning that's so fundamental to so much, not only academically, but I think socially as well. Deliberate practice really works, and educational technology is a tool that can really support deliberate practice. And it also provides data to drive these loops of improvement. And certainly in the context of the pandemic, we've seen, as Barbara said, more remote learning, but it's often not ideal online learning. But there's lots of examples and research to draw upon that could guide us towards the future in which we can take this opportunity in which we've been forced into more remote learning to do more ideal online learning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. That sets up well, I think, as we move to looking at applications to COVID. I do note with interest that your relevant exercise for students was to figure out their cell phone charges. In my day, it was one railroad, one train leaves a city at a certain time and others headed the other way. What time do they meet? So, but keeping it relevant, and particularly today, and someone who keeps it very relevant, and I appreciate the help that she's given GSoLEN over the last year, is Dr. Nancy Law. Nancy is a professor on the Faculty of Education at the University of Hong Kong. She was the founding director for the Center for Information Technology in Education, and where Dr. Law is known for her expertise in the integration of digital technology and learning and teaching to promote student-centered pedagogical innovations. And particularly of interest to me and many others is her investigation of student development and as digital citizens from early childhood to adult. So Nancy, thank you very much for being here, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you very much for the very kind invitation. How People Learn has been one of my favorite books. I can't find any other book that is a better sort of suitable introduction to the science of learning to students and teachers. So when the How People Learn 2 came out, I was very, very excited. So today what I'm going, so we've been, so there's the science of, so I would see How People Learn to be a fantastic synthesis of a lot of the work done in the area of the science of learning. And it not only give us theories, but also provide us with good pedagogical models, as well as a lot of resources like technology. So the question also is that, okay, we have so much, but can we use it? We heard a lot about complexity, and also Barbara was talking about process and design, and Ken was also using those words as well. But because I'm coming from a teacher education background, so for me, when I'm thinking about the process, I'm thinking about the process of learning and teaching. So more the processes that the people go through. And then the design to me is more like the design of learning. So what I'm going to talk about tonight, or well, I mean, to me it's tonight, it's more to do with my reflections on a study that we have done in Hong Kong, looking at online learning, how online learning actually impacted students, teachers, and school leaders, and how far actually in all these efforts have the science of learning really shown its impact. And of course, theoretically, a lot of what we know and a lot of what we already have should be able to help us through the kind of like crisis situation that we are in. So, okay. And what I particularly like about How People Learn is that it talks about multiple levels of factors influencing learners and learning: the social emotional, the contextual, and the cultural aspect. And to me, these are conditions for learning. So for the transformation and the societal levels, and the time, and also, of course, the brain also has to learn. So neuroscience studies how the brain changes. And these changes takes place over different periods of time. And based on these studies, we've been doing interventions and support, using these to support learning. So, and with these, so these different levels are needed when we think about learning. So when COVID-19 came, it's actually like a tsunami scale learning challenge to the entire community. So it's a challenge for individuals, of course. So not only students have to learn, and the students have to learn in a different way. It's also the teachers have to learn, the school middle managers have to learn, the school senior leaders have to learn, and the parents have to learn. But it's not just the individual level. The schools have to change in the way they work, even the timetable, even the technology, and I mean, whatever you can think of, you have to have a different mode and a different sort of medium. And actually the education system and the communities, including, you know, what we can help parents and teachers. So what we have done is, and I saw some of the chat also talked about in Hong Kong, we actually have probably the longest period of online learning. We stopped face-to-face teaching from the end of January last year, and it only sort of restarted around late May, early June in stages. So we were able to do our data collection with a lot of support from the community from mid-June to mid-July. And we had a lot of community engagement to support us. And we said the focus of the study is to have an action-oriented study to engage community partners in interpreting and making aligned efforts to support learnings at all levels, to in a way co-invent the new normal. So the focus is on studying online learning preparedness of students, families, teachers, school leaders, and school level e-learning, online learning preparedness. And we had 5 survey instruments to the different stakeholders. So I very quickly share some of the highlights of what we have found. First of all, just like what Barbara mentioned at the beginning, there is the individual differences in terms of equity, and we see that from our findings, students' socioeconomic status matters. So whether students have access to large screen devices differ, and also the level of stress of the students also differ. And we find that the low SES students, particularly the secondary school students, they suffer more. And but schools also matter. One of the key, what we call preparedness indicators from our study was something called the Bring Your Own Device program. We asked the schools whether they were participating in this program in Hong Kong. Well, basically, this is a program by the Hong Kong government to provide tablets or laptops to children who have, whose family do not have the means to provide them with their own individual device. But so in that sense, it is means tested. But at the same time, the government doesn't want to just give it out without ensuring that the students have something, that they would do with they would be learning using those devices. So basically, the schools have to register and say, okay, we want our students to be able to benefit from this program. And if they were to be doing so, they need to be also explaining, providing information about how the school is providing learning opportunities using with the students using their own device. And so we find that in fact, not that many schools actually participated at the school level. And so it affects the students who do not have those devices because the schools were not able to, they were not enrolling them. And of course, the schools have many different reasons, and some of the reasons is because the teachers are reluctant. Another important difference across schools is how the e-learning coordination team is organized. We find that there is a huge difference. Some schools only have 2 people, both are technicians. You don't have any teachers involved in coordinating e-learning, whereas some other schools have more than 20 people involved, going from all the way from senior management, who could be a vice principal or a academic leader for the whole school, to middle managers, subject panel leaders, and also other teachers and teachers of ICT and technicians. So so with these diversities, we also see that different schools actually some of the schools have quite sophisticated organizations of different functions, and these make a big difference. So we find that, say, we look at before the suspension, one of the items that we ask the students is the academic self-efficacy. And even before the school suspension, we can see, well, a divide there, academic divide. But during the school suspension, we ask the students about, how they feel and so on. And we see that this academic self-efficacy actually get lower for the low SES students and get higher for the high SES students. And we also ask the students whether during that period of time they learn new digital skills and do they have digital skills improvement. Now the 0 is actually the mean. So actually everybody say that they improve, but the low SES students improve the least and the high SES students improve the most. But if the schools were better organized, they are more prepared, they had more, the teachers had more experience of using e-learning in the classroom. So the e-learning preparedness was like what Barbara was saying, when we have e-learning, we were not looking at remote learning, but that is a very good preparation, in fact. And so we find that, so the orange is the low SES students. We're looking at whether they have differences. We find that for the low SES students, if the teachers are better prepared, they are able to be, so only the low SES students make a difference. The teachers use make a bigger difference, a significant difference. Also, they make a difference to their academic self-efficacy. And in terms of the participation in online activities, of course, then all the different SES groups would benefit. So we were also looking at what factors influence teachers' online teaching preparedness. And so the preparedness these are the preparedness outcomes. And we find that is this, of course, one factor is the self-efficacy of the teachers on designing, implementing online teaching. But in fact, an even more important factor is, according to analysis, the teachers are saying that they have been able to share and collaborate on online pedagogy with their peers in the school, and also their own priority for student-centered learning. So these are the best predictors. So, and in particular, is the teacher sharing and collaboration for online pedagogy has the greatest influence on teachers' online teaching preparedness. So here we talk about, again, the social and the, so it's the social emotional and the cultural aspect of the situation for the teachers' learning. We were also looking at the school leadership practices. In our survey, we looked at general leadership before school suspension, e-learning strategies before school suspension, the general school culture and the school climate. So culture is before school suspension and climate is during the school suspension. And then what the schools were planning, the leadership was planning to do after the school resumption. So based on our teacher survey findings, we find that these are the 3 most important predictors of teachers' preparedness. So how does the school leaders' preparedness influence or predict the teachers' preparedness? Then we find that there are 3 groups of factors, but the most important influence is the school culture of collaboration, trust, and openness to innovation. That's the most important. And then the leaders' overall school development priorities on teacher professional development. And then the third is, well, we find that if before suspension, if the e-learning strategies were not of good quality, they actually predict, they are negative predictors. So, and in particular for the teacher preparation, it's not just taking courses, but much more the teachers were able to work together with colleagues within the school or with teachers outside of the school on innovative curriculum transformation, curriculum innovation projects. So just to sum up, we find that, building a culture of trust, collaboration, and openness to innovation through multi-level school leadership is the key to online learning and teaching preparedness during the new normal, because this provides an opportunity for alignment, because everybody needs to change. So how can we get the change working? So, so I keep thinking, with How People Learn 1, we were able to learn much more about how children learn and what would be the kind of support that one can do. But with the How People Learn 2, we are understanding much more of the context and the cultures that influence their learning. So, but then these are focusing on still learning of the children or the learners, although of course it's talking about adults, but we are not talking about the other people who need to learn in order for these transformative ways of learning to take place. So I've been thinking, can we have a How People Learn 3? How can we align learning for learners, teachers, school leaders, and policymakers? So with this, this is the end of my sharing. And if you're interested, you can also find out more about our project and the published bulletins. Thank you.
So Nancy, thank you very much and for a great presentation and linking it to How People Learn 1, How People Learn 2, and I think I just heard How People Learn 3 has already been set up now. And indeed, that's going to be, I think, the direction of a lot of our questions is what is How People Learn 3 in this COVID era? And if I could take 2 or 3 of the questions and I believe combine them, which is, given the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, almost half the world's students are still facing some sort of disruption, latest, or at least sometime in early January, 31 nations had full school closures, another 48 were reduced or part-time, and given some of the more recent developments of the past few weeks, we may see that number even increase. So what is then the future of digital learning, and what implications, and I'm drawing from Paul and Simona and others, what implications do you see for post-COVID world with a characterized by more blended models of K-12 education, whatever, and then second part of that is what evidence exists on this type of learning, and what's transferable from How People Learn to the home learning situation. So anybody want to jump in and take that? And I think we've just been joined by Barbara, or we were joined earlier by Barbara. And so thank you very much for both the video and also your participation. So how do we make this work? Digital learning in this COVID environment.
Maybe I can begin a little bit. I think the important thing is we really need to understand how it's possible, and I think the concept of preparedness is important. So we've in our study we were actually seeing a lot of creative innovativeness, both in terms of the teachers and the parents and so on, and how can we get things working? One example it's just a community. But because we were publicizing our findings and people were seeing the digital inequity to be a serious issue and the SES aspect. So a lot of community efforts not only come in to support in terms of the hardware and also the bandwidth, but also there was a community of women leaders who were working with, they were saying, okay, how can we help parents who are not really well educated to learn how to help their children to do e-learning at home? And what they did was they created very short videos, a few minutes on YouTube. And then to show how, say, how do you help the child if you give them a mobile Wi-Fi router, what to do and so on. So that's also learning. So we need to have that kind of learning. And we see that, say, some schools have been actually talking about stage, they've been explaining how the school have gone through stages of organizing online learning. So the first stage, they were just clamoring around, trying to get things organized, and then the next thing, they try to actually organize online learning with Zoom for the core subjects, and then later on they were looking at other subjects, and then they were now sort of doing a more refined organization of the timetable, so that the say maybe the first half of the day is more structured learning. In the afternoon, they have more individualized sorts of coaching, tutoring with small groups and so on. So I think schools are actually, and then very recently, I have a lot of inquiries from schools saying, how can we do STEM? Organize STEM learning for children at home so that they can still have inquiry. So these are very good questions, and they are also beginning teachers to have some kind of solutions. And so one way we've been trying to promote this is, in addition to trying to do more consolidated sort of research, is to promote communication and collaboration, organizing a lot of these activities, seminars, online, focus groups and so on, so that people can actually learn from each other to solve the problems.
So Ken, I'd ask you to address this as well, particularly as we see, I know in the United States, but I'm in some other countries as well, a delay in openings, or in some cases actually going back to digital learning, at least in the short term.
Well, I think Nancy's point about teacher self-efficacy around e-learning is so important. And what I see in our schools here is that there are a lot of missed opportunities in essence because of, I think in some cases it's fear of the unknown. But I think the bigger issue is that we just haven't had that kind of professional development support for teachers to become more e-learning prepared. I think we know a lot about what we can do. Somebody asked about higher ed, and I know here at Carnegie Mellon University, we've been experimenting for years with blended instruction. So, for those of us who have been doing that, it was a natural transition. I, for example, give, I don't longer just give out reading assignments or just watch this lecture. They come with a quiz. There's a learn by doing element in the preparatory work before they come online. So they can asynchronously watch a video and read, but they only get so much from that. We have an analysis, by the way, that suggests that there's 6 times greater impact from answering formative assessment questions than the learning you get from reading or watching. Of course, you get reading and watching is good, but the doing is really powerful. So if we can have strategies like that, right, where our teachers can be preparing questions along with the materials they distribute. And better yet, if those questions can come with feedback to students, that can be super powerful. It's within reach, but it requires some teacher professional development.
I would build on what Ken and Nancy both said. I was studying the impact in higher education settings, and what we found is that those instructors, and these were at a lot less elite universities than Carnegie Mellon, so we were looking in broad access four-year universities and community colleges. Those that were already doing blended learning made the transition much more easily, both the students themselves and the instructors during COVID. And so I think as a public policy issue, whether it's Hong Kong or the United States or another country, that we need to set a higher bar for ourselves in terms of making sure that all of our families have access, not just theoretically that there's some computing device and some internet access, but that there's actually access that would enable them to do learning remotely if necessary. So I think that's one thing. And the other thing is preparing the teachers and college instructors. What we hear is there is a toll for them as well, not just in not knowing the technology, but they're no longer getting that reinforcement from nods or social interaction in the class. So those social emotional issues are important for them as well. And they're keenly aware that they're having trouble engaging their students. So ways to keep students actively engaged at a distance are something that we need to harness. A lot of the things some teachers are doing very well and that have been established in research, but also do a lot more work on that and a lot more professional development for teachers working together, as Nancy would tell us from her work.
And Barbara, you've touched on, I believe, but I just want to explore further a question from Sebastian Lapina on what would be the policy recommendations for contexts with for countries with high inequalities and gaps in technology. How did the report consider those?
Well, How People Learn Too did not talk about that, so I should say I'm not speaking for the academies. I'm just speaking for myself or perhaps for Digital Promise. But I would say we have instruments such as Nancy. We have ways of getting at least a fairly good handle on whether access is adequate for the kind of learning we want. And I really would encourage government bodies to treat universal access for learning as a basic citizen right.
And Heidi, How People Learn goes, I see you're getting ready to sign off, but How People Learn talks about the different types of learning. And it seems to me that in some ways, the necessity to understanding those has been accelerated by COVID and students having to learn in perhaps different ways in the traditional school, sitting in a traditional school. Any quick comments on that?
Well, I think it goes to the notion of affordances that Barbara was bringing up, that we have to be clear on goals for learning, and then for particular outcomes, we're looking for what's the right blend of learning experiences. So which things can you do in a virtual environment? Which things might you want to be supplementing the virtual experience with something that a student could even do at home? For example, in science, we talk a lot about what can you do outside that you could only do with that phenomena, but then how do you bring that into the virtual setting? So getting very clear on what kind of learning when, what are the goals, and then of the range of contexts and tools you have available, kind of mapping what's going to work best. So not one size fits all or assuming everything will become fully virtual easily, but really thinking about what's the range of resources and contexts for this learning, for this goal.
So I know we're getting up against the hour, and I want to thank very much all the participants and discussants, as well as those who attended. So I also said thank you very much to the Forum for World Education for making this possible, the chance to collaborate with you. We at the Global Science of Learning Education Initiative Network are going to be launching and Nancy, I'm particularly looking for your leadership on this too, are going to be launching working groups around digital learning. We've got one on Teacher Support Network, and now what is it we ought to be considering on digital learning, and particularly responding to the COVID and post-COVID era. So I want to thank those of you participating, and see if Susan Sclafani wants to say anything and wrap this up.
I think that we've had a very instructive session, and I hope that people will go to the site and also will perhaps download the chat, because there are lots of interesting comments and suggestions there. But I think that, as we said, I think Heidi's distinction and Barbara's distinction between digital learning and remote learning is a really important one. And we need to refer to what is going on now as remote learning, because this is not what Ken has studied. This is not what we want to see as part of the blended learning that we hope to see when schools get back into session. But I appreciate each of you for your contributions to this webinar. And in the chat, there is a link to fweforum.org/events, where you can find tape of the presentations as well as the individual slide presentations. So thank you all so much. And thank you, Bob, for moderating. It's the first of many opportunities to collaborate on such important issues. So thanks everyone for participating.
Yep, thank you.